following the recent backlash against Tyson Fury, there's a concerted effort underway to take the heat off him by deflecting blame onto other parties. Most of the people doing this have a pro-Fury agenda, obviously, while others might actually have good intentions, but they're just misguided. And I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit later on. But the tactic involves attacking Anthony Joshua, a man who is no longer in the heavyweight title picture, and also attacking the entire heavyweight division. It kind of reminds me of these former gangsters you see on YouTube who snitched on a bunch of people back in the days to avoid a life sentence. They'll often be up there claiming that virtually all gangsters are snitches in an attempt to try and take the heat off themselves. In fact, there's an American career criminal who was released from prison recently called Fleece Johnson. He became infamous while he was locked up for his exploits involving soap in the showers. All right, that's a euphemism. He became known as the Booty Warrior, and his infamous quote was, "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." So I think you can guess what I'm alluding to here. You know what he was doing to people in prison. Anyway, in a recent interview after his release, he claimed that every single man who's ever done over 10 years in prison is a booty warrior as well. Every single one of them, which is obviously complete nonsense. But he's saying it to try and take the heat off himself over the things that he did in prison. You see how that works? Same thing here with Tyson Fury. Condemned the entire heavyweight division in an attempt to take the heat off himself. An evil enemy will burn his own nation to the ground to rule over the ashes. That is literally what's going on here. Now, boxing has its problems. We know this, and the heavyweight division is no different. But to claim that these problems are far more acute at heavyweight than in any other division in boxing, and that the entire division is a disgrace, is not only false, but it also does a massive disservice to many fighters. And above all else, it gives Tyson Fury the carte blanche he wants and needs to continue ducking fights. But let's take Fury out of the equation for the moment and just look at the rest of the division. Alexander Usyk, an all-time great two-weight world champion, current unified heavyweight champion. As soon as he beat AJ, he attempted to unify twice. He's now fulfilling his mandatory obligations. Dubois first, followed by Hrgovic, and either Zhang or Joyce. So no issues with Usyk. He's been a model champion at heavyweight so far. Very few divisions in the entire sport have champions like Alexander Usyk. Below him, you've got a number of contenders fighting each other. First off, Joshua versus White. AJ didn't have to take the Dillian Whyte fight. He could have fought a far lesser opponent. By fighting White, he is risking that massive payday against Deontay Wilder. Eddie Hearn has stated in several interviews that the Saudis have told him in no uncertain terms that if AJ loses to White, the Wilder deal is off the table. That $50 million or whatever is gone. If that were to happen, Hearn said it doesn't necessarily mean that AJ wouldn't still fight Wilder anyway, but it would be for significantly less money, obviously. It would also be contingent on the manner of his loss to Dillian Whyte. So it's all ifs and buts. Perhaps it's just wishful thinking by Eddie Hearn because nothing is guaranteed. But what is guaranteed is that if AJ loses to Dillian Whyte, he won't be getting anywhere near the $50 million for his next fight that he's currently being offered for the Wilder fight. That's gone. So understand how high the stakes are here. Filip Hrgovic versus Dempsey McKean is another upcoming fight between heavyweight contenders, and it's a similar situation. Hrgovic is IBF mandatory. His world title shot is guaranteed. He doesn't have to take this fight with McKean. He could just fight a journeyman if he wanted to, and no one could blame him if he did, because world title shots are very hard to come by, especially if you're a talented fighter. Just look at Boots Ennis at welterweight. Neither Spence nor Crawford were ever going to voluntarily give him a shot at the title. He had to fight his way into a mandatory position, and that can be a very long process. And if you lose, you might have to wait several years for another title shot, if you even get one at all. That's how high the stakes are. That's the position Filip Hrgovic is in here. He could fight a journeyman in a tick-over fight if he wanted to preserve his mandatory position, but he's choosing to take on an unbeaten heavyweight instead. You've also got the winner of AJ White fighting Deontay Wilder in December. Wilder Ruiz is also still possible. In the meantime, they're currently negotiating. You've got Joyce versus Zhang 2. You've got Ajagba versus Kossobutski. That fight has just been made. You've also got Fabio Wardley versus David Adelaide. Both have a top 15 ranking now. So Heavyweight contenders are fighting each other. The division is moving. Let's compare that to the cruiserweight division. There's no undisputed champion, no unifications are happening, and there's hardly any contender matchups. Usyk moved up to heavyweight 4 years ago. They've had plenty of time to get it together in the cruiserweight division, but there's absolutely nothing happening. Moving down to light heavyweight. Again, there's no undisputed champion, this time thanks to Mauricio Sulaiman. And as far as contender matchups, you've got Buatsi versus Aziz, and that's about it. Super middleweight. You do have an undisputed champion in Canelo, but he's been ducking his mandatory for ages. And there are very few contender fights on the horizon. Benavidez doesn't seem to want to fight Morrell, for example, and there's not much else going on. Middleweight is even worse. There's no undisputed champion. Charlo hasn't fought in 2 years and counting. Golovkin has gone missing. Lara's fighting once a year against awful opposition. Aleem Kanuli is defending against Euro-level guys. Gualtieri just won a vacant belt against some obscure Brazilian fighter. Munguia has moved up. His fight with Derevyanchenko was at 168, and prior to that, he weren't fighting anyone anyway. And to top it all off, you've got a near 50-year-old Sergio Martinez with a top 5 ranking after beating no one. And again, Canelo vacated his middleweight belts several years ago, but the division is still stagnant. I could go on and mention more divisions, but you get the picture. No one can sit there with a straight face and try to claim that any of the divisions I've just mentioned are in a better state than the heavyweight division, especially if you take Fury out of the equation. And there's no point going back 2 or 3 years when there actually were some good fights happening in those other weight classes, because I can do the exact same thing with the heavyweight division. Comparing the heavyweight division in 2023 to other divisions 2 or 3 years ago is not a like-for-like comparison. What is actually going on in those other divisions today in 2023? Which fights are scheduled or in negotiations right now? If you apply the same degree of scrutiny to all the other divisions in boxing, what you find is that heavyweight actually fares better than most divisions, not worse. It's not perfect, of course not, but very few divisions ever are. Boxing as a whole isn't perfect. In fact, if you said boxing as a whole is a disgrace rather than the heavyweight division specifically, that's actually a more reasonable position. UFC fans often make that statement. I don't agree with it, but it's a more reasonable position because it acknowledges that most of the issues in boxing are ubiquitous. They're found throughout the entire sport. They aren't exclusive to or most prevalent in the heavyweight division. But as I said at the start, there are people like Frank Warren's friends in the media who are trying to destroy the reputation of the heavyweight division in an attempt to take the heat off Tyson Fury. An evil enemy will burn his own nation to the ground to rule over the ashes. However, of all the people doing this, a small minority of them might just be misguided rather than malicious. Carl Froch, for example, before criticizing Tyson Fury, he'll often criticize AJ first. I don't think he does that to protect Fury or take the heat off Fury. I think he does it to protect himself and take the heat off himself. He doesn't want to be accused of being anti-Fury and by extension, pro-Joshua. Criticizing AJ every time he criticizes Fury is his misguided attempt at appearing to be objective. As I've explained in several previous videos, objectivity does not mean criticizing every fighter an equal amount. That is literally the exact opposite of objectivity. That would be like giving every criminal the exact same prison sentence, irrespective of which crime they've committed or how long their record is. You don't give a first-time offender who stole a Mars bar the same sentence as a serial bank robber, do you? That wouldn't be fair at all. It would be totally absurd. Same principle applies when meting out criticism in boxing. Some fighters are much bigger culprits than others. Therefore, it's fair and appropriate that they get criticized more often and more severely than others. So if you see someone trying to criticize all the other heavyweights an equal amount to Tyson Fury, that's not an objective position at all. That's a pro-Fury position, whether they intend it to be or not. Furthermore, just like all world champions in boxing, Alexander Usyk and Tyson Fury are rightly held to a higher standard than the contenders or ex-champions because as a champion, you are staking your claim as the king of the division. The sanctioning body whose belt you have is holding you aloft as king and granting you certain privileges, such as getting the lion's share of the money against mandatories, being allowed to stay inactive for longer periods without losing your position, and so on. As such, you have an obligation to prove that you're worthy of that title as champion and the privileges that come with it by fighting the best opponents available each time you step out. So you're in a position of power, but with that power comes responsibilities and obligations, both legal and moral. Some champions, like Tyson Fury, shirk those responsibilities and abuse their power, and this harms boxing far more than 99% of contenders ever could. If a highly ranked contender has successive fights against poor opposition, or they're inactive for a long period, they get dropped down the rankings, just like Frank Sanchez recently was, or removed from the rankings altogether, just like Conor Benn. Michael Hunter is another one. He used to be highly ranked at heavyweight, but he's since been dropped out of the rankings altogether due to inactivity and poor opposition. If you're ranked number 3 and you only ever fight guys who are ranked outside the top 10, eventually you're going to lose that number 3 ranking. Whereas if a champion constantly picks low-hanging fruit for voluntary defenses, he still remains champion. He doesn't lose his position. A recent example of this was when Tyson Fury fought Derek Chisora for a 3rd time. Chisora was ranked something like 13 or 14 by the WBC at the time, but Fury didn't lose his position as champion by taking that fight. Now, obviously, the mandatory system is supposed to counteract this issue by forcing champions to face a top contender roughly once a year. Unfortunately, sometimes sanctioning bodies are slow to enforce mandatories due to cozy relationships they have with certain fighters, the WBC being the biggest culprit. An example being Jamal Charlo, who hasn't fought for over 2 years, yet he still maintains his position as WBC middleweight champion. Another example being Tyson Fury, who hasn't been issued a mandatory in over a year, allowing him to have this Mickey Mouse fight with Francis Ngannou without losing his position as champion. Very rarely will a contender be allowed to behave like that without eventually losing their position in the rankings. There are some exceptions, Deontay Wilder being one of them, and I'll cover all that in a separate video about rankings and how they work. But for the most part, only champions are permitted to cherry pick and be inactive to such an extent without losing their position. This is one of several reasons that I'm not as hard on contenders as I am on champions, because I don't need to be. There are consequences for contenders which many champions don't suffer. Tyson Fury, as WBC heavyweight champion, not only claims to be the best of his era, but also the greatest heavyweight in history. As such, at a bare minimum, he needs to at least attempt to prove that position by unifying with Alexander Usyk. That is by far and away the most important fight in the heavyweight division. No other fight comes close as far as affirming the division's credibility. Yet Fury has been ducking that fight for coming up 2 years in November. This is not only by far the biggest issue in the heavyweight division, but one of the biggest issues in the entire sport. There are champions ducking champions in other divisions too, of course. Fury's not the only one, but he is the loudest one, and he is the most famous one. And when you've got a high-profile champion behaving like that, it has a much greater impact on the image of the division as a whole. Nothing that any heavyweight contender is or isn't doing has anywhere near as much negative impact as what Tyson Fury is doing. Not even close. To claim otherwise is to give Tyson Fury carte blanche to continue ducking fights, whether that's the intention or not. If you remove Tyson Fury from the equation, the reality is that heavyweight is actually one of the healthier divisions in boxing. It's not the healthiest, but it's certainly nowhere near the bottom of the pile. You've got an all-time great 2-weight unified world champion in Usyk, who wants all the smoke, currently taking care of his mandatories. You've got AJ versus White, the winner fighting Wilder. You've got Zhang versus Joyce. You've got Ajagba versus Kossobutski. Fabio Wardley versus David Adelai. Wilder and Ruiz are still negotiating. The division is moving, as much as Team Fury would want you to believe otherwise. Are you sick and tired of the mainstream mindset? Does the dogmatic conformity and pathological ignorance have you tearing your hair out in frustration? Then don't be alone. Come and join our brotherhood on Patreon. We stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. You'll gain access to my weekly topical podcast, where we take more deep dives than Jacques Cousteau on an endless variety of subjects. There's also videos, interviews, live Q&As, as well as a vast back catalogue of previous episodes, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen via the Patreon app or download in high-quality MP3. Connect with myself and hundreds of other members in our Element chat group. There's no contract, no commitment, you can cancel at any time, and it's cheaper than a Mickey D's McMuffin. Just head to my Patreon page via the link below this video and select the tier called the Brotherhood of Reason. I'll see you over there.